The lonely giantess. Vereka walked through the busy space station, her large boots making a heavy sound against the metal floor. The station was full of life. Aliens of all shapes and sizes moved around her, talking, laughing, and going about their business. But as soon as they noticed her, they stopped. Some stared, others whispered. A few quickly stepped out of her way. She was used to it. Vereka was a Tarkani, a warrior race known for their strength and size. Even among her own kind, she was tall. Among the smaller species that lived on the station, she was a giant. Her thick, muscular arms, curved black horns, and deep purple skin made her look fierce. She had sharp golden eyes that could see far and a voice so deep it rumbled like thunder when she spoke. She knew what others thought of her. Too big, too strong, too terrifying. No one ever dared to approach her. No one ever tried to be her friend. And love, that was a foolish dream. Vereka carried a large crate on her shoulder, filled with metal parts for a repair job. She could hear the whispers behind her. "Look at her size," one alien muttered. "I bet she could break a human in half with one hand." Who would ever want to be near her? She clenched her jaw, but said nothing. She had learned long ago that arguing was useless. It didn't matter how much she tried to be gentle, how much she tried to stay quiet. People always assumed she was dangerous. She reached the docking bay where her ship was being repaired. The workers nearby saw her and quickly moved aside, avoiding eye contact. She sighed. Then she heard a voice, a human voice. "Hey there, need help carrying that?" She turned her head in surprise. A human man stood nearby, looking up at her with a friendly smile. He was much smaller than her, only reaching her chest. He had short brown hair, a little scruffy, and warm blue eyes that didn't hold any fear. His clothes were simple, a mechanic's jumpsuit with oil stains on the sleeves. Vereka frowned. No one had ever offered to help her before. "I don't need help," she said flatly, shifting the crate on her shoulder. The human didn't leave. He crossed his arms and grinned. "Still, it looks heavy. You sure?" She narrowed her eyes. Was he mocking her? Was this some kind of joke? But there was no laughter in his face, no cruel smirk like the others. He looked genuine. She let out a small huff. "I am sure." He shrugged. "All right, just thought I'd ask. Name's David, by the way." Vereka blinked. Why was he introducing himself? She watched as he wiped his hands on a rag and leaned against a nearby workbench. He wasn't afraid of her. He wasn't avoiding her like everyone else. Why? She didn't know what to say. She had spent so long pushing people away that she had forgotten how to talk to someone who actually wanted to talk to her. After a moment, she simply nodded. "Vereka." David smiled. "Nice to meet you, Vereka. You new to the station?" She hesitated. Should she answer? Should she walk away? Before she could decide, David continued. "I work in the mechanic bay. You fly a ship, or just passing through?" Vereka found herself answering before she could stop. "My ship is being repaired. I will leave once it is ready." David nodded. "Ah, that explains the parts. You're doing the repairs yourself." She tilted her head. "Yes, I do not trust others with my ship." David chuckled. "Smart. Some of the mechanics here are good, but a few would overcharge you for simple work." Vereka studied him. He was different. Most people avoided her. But David acted as if her size didn't matter, as if she was just another person. She shifted the crate again and glanced toward her ship. She should go. She didn't have time for pointless conversation. But as she started to turn away, David spoke again. "Hey, if you ever need a hand with the repairs, let me know. I don't mind helping." She paused. No one had ever offered to help her before. She didn't know what to say, so she just gave him a short nod and walked toward her ship. But as she left, she noticed something strange. For the first time in a long time, someone had spoken to her without fear. and it made her feel something she hadn't felt in years. The fearless human. Veraka had met humans before. They were small, fast-talking, and always afraid of her. Some tried to hide it with nervous jokes. Others stared like she was some kind of wild beast, waiting for her to snap. But David was different. She noticed it the next day when she passed through the marketplace. The station's market was a crowded, chaotic place. Vendors shouted over each other, trying to sell everything from alien food to rare ship parts. The air smelled of metal, spices, and something fried that sizzled loudly in a nearby stall. Veraka moved through the crowd, careful not to bump into anyone. She knew what would happen if she did. Watch it, giant. Tarkani freak. Learn to walk properly. The insults came before she could even say anything. A small reptilian vendor scowled at her as if her existence was an offense. She ignored him and kept walking. Then she saw him. David. He was standing at a food stall, laughing as he handed credits to a grumpy old vendor. He had a small bag in his hands, filled with something steaming. He noticed her instantly. Veraka. He called out, stepping toward her without hesitation. Several heads turned. People stared. A human, calling a Tarkani by name, willingly walking toward her. She could already hear the whispers. She braced herself, expecting him to stop at a distance, maybe realizing his mistake, maybe backing away like everyone else did when they got too close. But he didn't. He walked right up to her, grinning like nothing was unusual. Ever tried human food? Veraka blinked. What? She looked down at the bag in his hand. It smelled strange, spicy, oily, and completely unfamiliar. I do not eat human food, she said. David smirked. Sounds like you've never even tried it. She frowned. I do not. Before she could finish, he reached into the bag, pulled out a small golden brown stick, and held it out to her. Just one bite. Veraka stared at him. No one had ever done this before. No one had ever tried to share food with her. Around them, the market had gone quiet. Aliens pretended not to watch, but she could feel their stares, hear their whispers. What is he doing? He's insane. Does he not know how dangerous she is? Veraka clenched her jaw. She should walk away. She should not care. But there was something about the way David looked at her. No fear, no hesitation, just expectation. She let out a slow breath, reached out, and took the food from his hand. Carefully, she brought it to her mouth, sniffed it once, then bit into it. It was good. Salty, crunchy, a little spicy, but not bad. David's grin widened. See, not so bad, right? She swallowed and shrugged. It is acceptable. David laughed. That's Tarkani for amazing, right? She almost smiled. Almost. Then, a harsh voice cut through the moment. Human. Step away from the Tarkani before you get yourself killed. Veraka turned sharply. A large, armored reptilian alien had stepped forward. His yellow eyes locked onto David like a predator spotting easy prey. The market fell silent. David looked at the alien, then at Veraka. What's his problem? Veraka knew exactly what his problem was. The Tarkani had a reputation. People feared them. They were seen as warriors, killers, dangerous beings who should not mix with the smaller, weaker species. And here was a tiny human standing comfortably next to her, sharing food, acting like they were equals. It was an insult to those who believed in fear. The reptilian stepped closer. Tarkani do not belong with humans. David raised an eyebrow. She's just eating. Didn't know that was a crime. The alien's eyes narrowed. I am warning you. Veraka's muscles tensed. She knew how this would go. The moment would spiral into a fight. She would win, but then the station security would be after her. She opened her mouth to tell David to walk away, to leave before things got worse. But before she could speak, David did something she did not expect. He laughed. A short, sharp laugh. Not nervous, not mocking, just amused. The reptilian's eyes widened in surprise. David shook his head, crossing his arms. Let me get this straight. You think I need protection from Veraka? The alien blinked. She is a Tarkani. You are a fragile human. David snorted. Buddy, I've seen Veraka lift a crate twice my size like it was nothing. If she wanted to crush me, she could do it in a second. The reptilian smirked. Exactly. David's grin did not fade. But she doesn't, he said simply. You know why? Because she's not a monster. She's not dangerous. She's just someone trying to live her damn life. The reptilian hesitated. The market was dead silent. Veraka stared at David. No one had ever spoken like that for her. No one had ever stood beside her, in front of her, without fear. For the first time, she wasn't the one making people afraid. Someone was fighting for her. The reptilian growled, clearly unsure how to respond. Finally, he spat on the ground and walked away. Slowly, the market returned to normal. Conversations started again. The tension faded. David turned back to her, stuffing another piece of food into his mouth. Well, that was awkward. Veraka just stared at him. You are strange, she said finally. David grinned. Yeah, but you're still talking to me. Veraka said nothing. Because he was right. And for the first time in her life, she didn't mind. A bet in the bar. The bar was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of alien liquors and burning plasma coils. Conversations buzzed around the room, a mix of deep, guttural voices and high-pitched chatter. The place was alive with smugglers, mercenaries, and station workers, all looking to drink away their troubles. Veraka sat alone in the corner, a massive tankard in front of her. Her golden eyes scanned the room, watching as people laughed, gambled, and drank. No one dared to sit near her. It was always the same. Too big, too strong, too intimidating. She took a slow sip of her drink, feeling the warmth spread through her. Then she heard it. Laughter, human laughter. Her sharp ears picked it up instantly. Across the bar, at a round table near the center, David sat with his crew, laughing over some story. His voice was relaxed, his body language open. He belonged there. He fit. Veraka forced her gaze away. Of course he did. Humans had that ability, to slip into places like they were meant to be there. Unlike her. She had tried. Once. Long ago. It had ended in broken tables, angry voices, and a bruised ego. So she stopped trying. She took another sip. It didn't matter. She was used to being alone. But then, she heard something that made her grip tighten around her tankard. I bet you wouldn't last 5 minutes sitting with her. The voice was loud enough to carry over the noise. One of the humans at David's table. Veraka's jaw tightened. She knew that tone. Mocking. Amused. Another voice. Laughing. Hell, I bet no one's even spoken to her outside of work. She exhaled through her nose, keeping her face calm. Let them talk. It wasn't anything new. But then she heard David's voice. You guys are idiots. Silence. She glanced toward the table. David was leaning back in his chair, arms crossed, a smirk on his face. He wasn't laughing. One of his crewmates grinned. Oh, come on. You're telling me you'd actually go over there. Sit with her. Have a drink. David shrugged. Why not? Another human chuckled. All right, big shot. Prove it. 10 credits say you won't. David's smirk widened. Make it 20. The table erupted in laughter. Someone clapped the human who made the bet on the back. Deal. Veraka's grip tightened around her drink. This was a joke. A bet. She should ignore it. But something inside her burned. She had spent her whole life being a challenge, a dare, a story to tell. She was not in the mood to be won tonight. So when David stood up, tankard in hand, and walked straight toward her table, she set her drink down with a slow, deliberate movement. The bar went silent. She could feel the weight of dozens of eyes watching. David pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, completely at ease. "Hey," he said casually, lifting his drink. "Mind if I join you?" Vioreka leaned back, crossing her arms over her broad chest. She stared at him for a long moment, her golden eyes unreadable. Then her lips curled into a slow, deliberate smirk. "You already did." David chuckled. "Fair enough." He took a sip of his drink like he wasn't sitting across from the most feared warrior on the station, like he wasn't the only human brave, or foolish, enough to do so. Vioreka tilted her head slightly. "So tell me, what did you wager?" David didn't even try to deny it. He grinned. 20 credits. Vioreka's smirk widened. "That is all I am worth." David's expression didn't change. "Nah. But if I made it higher, they would have gotten suspicious." She blinked. "That was unexpected." He took another sip. "Besides, I was going to sit with you anyway." This just made it fun. Her fingers drummed against the table. "You are either very brave or very stupid." David grinned. "A little of both, probably." She huffed. Amused. Against her will, but amused nonetheless. Across the room, she could see his crew watching, waiting, expecting her to scare him off. She could do it, easily. One growl, one sharp movement, and he would leave. But for some reason, she didn't want him to. Vioreka picked up her drink. "If you are going to sit with me, human, you will drink like a warrior." David's eyes glinted with challenge. That a test? A demand? She signaled to the bartender, who raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. A moment later, 2 massive tankards of Tarkanite fire brew were slammed onto the table. The drink was strong enough to make most species pass out after one sip. Humans, they usually didn't last long. David picked up his tankard without hesitation. "All right then. Let's see what you've got." He took a deep drink. The bar watched in silence. Vioreka expected him to cough, to grimace, to slam the drink down and declare her insane. But David just swallowed, exhaled sharply, and grinned. Not bad. Her eyebrows lifted. Interesting. She picked up her own tankard and drank. The fiery liquid burned down her throat, but she was used to it. She set the drink down and studied the human across from her. David leaned forward, his grin never fading. "So tell me, Vioreka, what do I win for passing your little test?" She tilted her head. "You are still conscious. That is your prize." David laughed, loud and full. For the first time in a long time, Vioreka found herself enjoying a conversation. The bar was still watching, still waiting for the moment she scared him away. But as the night went on, as they traded drinks and stories, one thing became clear: David wasn't going anywhere. And for the first time in her life, Vioreka didn't mind. Proving it's real. The station's artificial night cycle had begun, dimming the overhead lights and casting long shadows across the corridors. Most bars and markets were still alive with sound, but the mechanic bays, where the air smelled of grease and burnt metal, had fallen quiet. Vioreka sat on the open ramp of her ship, absently running a sharpening stone along the edge of a curved dagger. The rhythmic shuck of metal scraping against stone was a comforting sound, one she had known since childhood. She didn't expect company. She had spent the last few years avoiding it. But tonight was different. Still awake. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. The voice was already familiar. David. She could hear the scuff of his boots on the metal floor as he approached, his movements casual, unhurried. He had no reason to be here, not at this hour, not when most of the station was shutting down for the night. Yet, here he was. She slid the blade back into its sheath and set it aside. Humans require more sleep than this, do they not? David leaned against a crate a few feet away, arms crossed. He wasn't in his work jumpsuit anymore, just a dark shirt, sleeves rolled up, and a pair of cargo pants. He looked comfortable, like he had been here 100 times before. "Maybe," he said, smirking. But some things keep a man awake. Vereca raised an eyebrow. Like what? David shrugged, thinking. Questions. Unfinished business. She huffed. Is that why you are here? Unfinished business. His grin faded just slightly. Sort of. He hesitated, just for a second. That alone was strange. David wasn't the type to hesitate. Vereca leaned back against the ship's hull, golden eyes narrowing. Speak plainly, human. You always do. David exhaled through his nose, tilting his head slightly. All right. You ever had someone pretend to like you? As a joke. She froze. The word struck her harder than she expected. She knew the feeling well. Too well. Her shoulders tensed, and for the briefest moment, her mind flickered back, years ago, back to her first time on a non-Tarkani station. Back when she had been younger, still hopeful. She had been foolish. She had believed. She had thought someone had truly wanted her company, had wanted to know her. She had been wrong. The memory burned like old wounds never fully healed. Slowly, she looked up, meeting David's gaze. His expression was serious now, his usual smirk gone. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't mocking. He was asking. He was proving something. Vereca exhaled. Yes, she said finally. I have. David nodded, as if that was the answer he expected. Then you know why I'm here. She tilted her head slightly. To prove something. David let out a short chuckle. To you. Maybe. To them. Definitely. Vereca frowned. Them? David glanced toward the corridor leading back to the main levels of the station. The idiot who thought I wouldn't sit with you. The ones who thought I was just playing some kind of game. She watched him carefully. And you are not. His eyes locked onto hers. No, he said, without hesitation. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. There was no noise now, no bar full of watching eyes, no audience waiting for the punchline, just the two of them. And the silence between them was not uncomfortable. Vereca studied him. Humans were strange, bold, reckless, fascinating. But they were also clever. Some were liars. Some knew how to make people believe things that weren't real. Was he one of them? She didn't know. But she wanted to. Vereca leaned forward slightly, resting her arms on her knees. You speak well, human, but words are easy. David smirked, the cocky spark returning to his eyes. You want proof. She raised an eyebrow. Yes. He leaned forward as well, mirroring her posture. All right. What do you want? Vereca tapped a finger against the metal of the ship's ramp, thinking. You are a mechanic, yes. David nodded. She gestured toward the open panel on the side of her ship, where wires and circuits were exposed. My stabilizer array has been malfunctioning. You say you are not playing a game. She tilted her head, watching him closely. Then fix it. David grinned. That's it. You want me to fix your ship to prove I'm not messing with you. She crossed her arms. Words are easy. Actions matter. David laughed, running a hand through his hair. Dan, you don't make things simple, do you? Vereca smirked. No. David shook his head, still grinning. All right, challenge accepted. He stood, rolling his shoulders, then cracked his knuckles. Vereca leaned back, watching as he moved to examine the stabilizer panel. He muttered something under his breath about Tarkani engineering being a nightmare, but his hands were steady as he worked, tools clicking against metal. She didn't say anything. She just watched. Because actions mattered. And if David was telling the truth, then maybe, just maybe, she had found someone who wasn't afraid of her. Maybe, for the first time in her life, she had found someone who truly saw her. And that thought. That was more dangerous than any fight she had ever been in. The challenge. The next morning, the station was awake long before the artificial sun cycles flickered to full brightness. Mechanics hauled crates of spare parts. Vendors shouted out prices for their wares. and security officers patrolled the walkways with tired, uninterested gazes. Viraka had been up for hours. She sat at the edge of a maintenance bay, absently rolling a metal bolt between her fingers, deep in thought. David had fixed her stabilizer. That wasn't the surprising part. Humans were clever, fast learners. She had seen them fix, build, destroy, and rebuild faster than most species could comprehend. No, the surprising part was that he had done it without hesitation, without asking for anything in return, without the usual jokes, the usual fear, as if being around her was normal. That was new. She wasn't sure what to do with it. So, she did what any Tarkani would do. She tested him. "You want a challenge?" David looked up from where he was refilling a coolant line in the bay. His sleeves were pushed up, smudges of oil on his forearm. He raised an eyebrow. "Didn't I just pass one last night?" Viraka folded her arms. "That was proof. This is different." David smirked, wiping his hands on a rag. "All right, I'm listening." She took a step closer, tilting her head slightly. "You like to act brave. But I wonder, are you strong, or just reckless?" David's grin widened. "Are those my only two options?" "Yes." David chuckled, tossing the rag onto a crate. "All right, giantess. What do you have in mind?" Viraka gestured toward a small training area on the edge of the mechanic sector. A few crates had been stacked into an open ring, a place where workers sometimes passed time sparring with harmless electric batons. "You and me," she said. "One match. No weapons, no tricks, just strength." David stared at her. Then he laughed. A deep, genuine laugh. "You want to arm wrestle me?" Viraka raised an eyebrow. "You think that is funny?" David shook his head, still grinning. No. Do you realize the size difference here?" Viraka did. She was twice his size. She could lift crates that weighed more than two humans combined. There was no universe in which he could win. But that wasn't the point. She studied him. "You think I will break you?" David smirked. "Nah, just wondering how long I'll last." She almost smiled. Almost. "Then sit," she said, moving toward the ring. A few workers noticed. They nudged each other, whispered. The humans in particular looked shocked. "Is he serious?" one muttered. "He's dead," another whispered. David ignored them. Of course he did. He pulled up a crate, sat down across from her, and placed his arm on the table. Viraka did the same. She watched him carefully. Humans were good at hiding their fear, but she could see past that. She saw no hesitation. Interesting. She curled her fingers around his hand. He was smaller, but his grip was firm. He had calloused hands. Strong hands. Still, this was going to be over in seconds. "Ready?" she asked. David grinned. "Go." Viraka pushed. For a split second, his arm barely moved. Then, it did. It trembled under the pressure. She saw his muscles tense, his teeth clench, his forearm strain. He was fighting it. Not winning. Not even close. But fighting. And for some reason, that made her pause. Humans were fragile, yes. But they were stubborn. They held on, even when the odds were against them. Especially when the odds were against them. David's knuckles went white. His breath came sharp and focused. But he didn't give up. Viraka narrowed her eyes. "You do not have to prove yourself, human." David grunted. "Who says I'm trying to?" He pushed back. He had no chance. She could end this in a second. But something about the way he fought, the way he refused to surrender even when he was clearly outmatched, made her hesitate. Viraka had faced warriors before. Stronger, bigger, faster. But David was none of those things. He was something else. And for the first time in a long time, she wanted to see how far someone would go before they broke. She smirked and let the match continue. Minutes passed. David's face was red. His arm shook violently. Still, he did not give up. He laughed, breathless, shaking his head. Dan, you're strong. Vereka chuckled. You are not weak. David grinned, despite the pain. Yeah, then why am I losing? She tilted her head. Because I am stronger. And with that, she slammed his hand to the table. The entire mechanic bay went silent. Then, cheers. Laughter. Someone even clapped. Vereka sat back, rolling her shoulders. Not bad. Human. David flexed his fingers, shaking out the soreness. I'll take that as a win. She smirked. You lost. He grinned. Yeah, but I lasted longer than 5 seconds. That's gotta count for something. Vereka studied him. He had fought against impossible odds and had done so without fear. She had to admit, that was impressive. And for the first time in her life, she liked having someone around who did not see her as something to fear. David stretched, rolling his shoulder. You ever think about getting a drink after beating someone into the ground? Vereka raised an eyebrow. Are you challenging me to a drinking match now? David smirked. Depends. You afraid? Vereka let out a deep, rumbling laugh. You are an interesting one, human. And for once, she didn't mind having company. A warrior's heart. The station's upper levels were quieter at night, far removed from the noise of the lower market decks and repair bays. Here, the halls stretched wide, lined with observation windows that looked out into the endless dark of space. The artificial lights flickered between dim and warm, mimicking a planetary evening cycle. Vereka stood at one of those windows, arms crossed over her chest, staring into the void. She had seen 1,000 stars, fought on 100 worlds. Yet, tonight, the vastness of space did not feel as empty. Behind her, she heard boots approaching. She didn't need to turn around. You lost, she said without looking. David chuckled. Yeah. No need to remind me. She smirked. You remind yourself enough. David moved beside her, leaning against the railing that separated them from the thick, reinforced glass. His reflection stared back at him. Messy brown hair, tired blue eyes, and the faintest of bruises forming along his forearm. That arm wrestling match cost me a full night of feeling in my hand, he muttered, flexing his fingers. Vereka grunted. You chose to fight me. David turned his head, looking at her. Yeah, I did. Something about the way he said it made her pause. She glanced down at him. He was small compared to her. All humans were. Yet, in the last few days, David had proven something most others never did. He stayed. Not because of fear, not because of obligation. He stayed because he wanted to. Vereka had never known what that felt like. The silence stretched between them, comfortable. David sighed and tilted his head back, looking up through the window. Ever wonder how big space really is? Vereka huffed. No, it is simply there. David smirked. That's a very Tarkini answer. She shrugged. Tarkini do not waste time on things that do not change. David was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, what about things that do? Vereka frowned. Explain. David's grin faded slightly. He hesitated, shifting his weight, then exhaled through his nose. People change, he said finally. Perspectives change. Hell, I'm pretty sure I've changed since I met you. Vereka raised an eyebrow. And how is that? David chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. Well, for one, I've learned not to underestimate Tarkani's strength. She smirked. That is a wise lesson. But more than that, he continued, turning toward her, I've learned that you're more than what people think you are. Vereka stilled. David's gaze was steady, not mocking, not cautious, just honest. You think I do not know this, she said, voice quieter than she intended. David shook his head. I think you don't believe anyone else does. She didn't respond. Because he was right. For years, she had heard the whispers, the muttered comments, The looks of caution, of fear, of discomfort. Tarkani were warriors, soldiers, weapons, not people. Never people. David broke the silence first. "Tell me something," he said, folding his arms. "Has anyone ever told you that you're impressive?" Viraka blinked. "In battle, yes." David shook his head. "Not just in battle." She frowned, unsure how to answer. David sighed, then took a step closer. "You're strong. You're disciplined. You carry yourself like someone who doesn't care what others think. But I know that's not completely true." Her jaw clenched slightly. "You assume much." David smirked. "I pay attention." Viraka turned fully toward him, towering over him as she had done countless times before. Yet David didn't back away. "Why do you stay human?" she asked. Her voice was quiet but firm. David shrugged. "Because I want to." No hesitation, no doubt. Just truth. Viraka studied him, her golden eyes searching his face for deception, for uncertainty. She found none. For the first time in years, she did not feel like a challenge, a wager, or an obstacle. She felt seen. She let out a slow breath. "You are strange, David." David grinned. "I get that a lot." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, David reached into his jacket and pulled something out. A small, metal pendant. Simple, worn from years of use. He held it out to her. Viraka narrowed her eyes. "What is this?" David shrugged. "A gift. Humans do that sometimes, you know." Viraka hesitated before taking it. The metal was cool against her fingers. David smiled. "It's nothing fancy, just a little charm from Earth. I used to carry it around for luck. Figured you might need it more than me." Viraka looked down at the pendant, then back at him. Tarkani did not accept gifts lightly. A gift meant trust, respect, a bond. Slowly, she closed her fingers around it. "Then I will not break it." David chuckled. "That's the idea." She tucked the pendant into the strap across her chest, feeling its weight settle against her armor. David stepped back, stretching his arms behind his head. "Well, I should probably get some sleep before I start making even worse decisions." Viraka smirked. "Worse than challenging a Tarkani to an arm wrestling match." David grinned. "Depends on your definition of worse." He turned to leave, but before he could take a step, Viraka spoke. "David." He paused. She hesitated only for a moment. Then she exhaled. "Thank you." David looked over his shoulder, his grin softening. "Anytime, Viraka." And with that, he walked away, hands in his pockets, disappearing down the corridor. Viraka stood there, alone once more. But for the first time in years, she did not feel lonely. Love needs no sighs. The station was never truly silent. Even in the artificial night cycle, deep hums of machinery pulsed through the walls, a constant reminder that they were floating in the void. Most of the vendors had shut down, and only a few late-night wanderers drifted through the corridors, their footsteps echoing softly. Viraka stood alone on one of the upper walkways, overlooking the docking bays below. Her sharp golden eyes traced the outline of the ships, the flickering neon lights reflecting off their hulls. She should have left days ago. The repairs on her ship were done. Her mission was waiting. But she hadn't left. Because of him. She frowned, tightening her grip on the railing. This was foolish, dangerous, unnecessary. Tarkani warriors did not get attached. They fought. They won. They moved on. Yet she had stayed, and she was beginning to understand why. Footsteps behind her. Light, steady, familiar. David. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to. "You've been standing here a while," he said, stepping up beside her. She exhaled slowly. "You watch me often, human." David grinned. "Only when you look like you're thinking too hard." Viraka smirked despite herself. "I do not think too hard." "Uh-huh," David said, leaning against the railing. "Then what's keeping you here?" She stiffened, straight to the point. As always, David was watching her now, his blue eyes sharp, his grin softened by something quieter, something real. She could lie. Tell him she was merely waiting for the next fuel cycle, that she had been delayed. But lying had never been her strength. Instead, she sighed and looked at him fully. "You." David blinked. "Me." Vereka nodded. "You are the reason I have not left." David scratched the back of his neck, his grin turning slightly crooked. "Well, can't say I expected that answer." Vereka huffed. "Neither did I." Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't heavy. It wasn't awkward. David rubbed his hands together. "So let me get this straight. You, a towering, terrifying Tarkani warrior, are sticking around because of me, the short, stubborn mechanic." Vereka narrowed her eyes. "You are not short. For a human." David chuckled. "That's a very specific compliment, but I'll take it." She smirked, then turned back to the docks. "I do not understand you, human." David exhaled. "I get that a lot." She tilted her head. "You should fear me. You should avoid me, as the others do. And yet, you do not." David leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Want to know why?" Vereka glanced at him. "Yes." David smiled, but there was something different about it this time. Something softer. "Because I see you," he said simply. "Not just the strength. Not just the reputation. You." She inhaled slowly, the words hitting her harder than she expected. For years, she had been a warrior, a challenge, a monster to some, an obstacle to others. No one had ever just seen her. She clenched her fists at her sides. "That is dangerous." David's expression didn't change. "Yeah, but so are you. And that hasn't scared me off yet." Her heart pounded in her chest, something unfamiliar and terrifying swelling inside her. She had survived wars. She had faced death without flinching. Yet, standing here, hearing those words, she had never felt more vulnerable. Slowly, she reached into the strap across her chest and pulled out the small metal pendant David had given her. She turned it over in her fingers, feeling its weight. David watched her, still carrying that. She nodded. "It is important to you." David smirked. "It is now." She hesitated for only a second before gripping the pendant tightly. Then, in one swift motion, she grabbed David by the front of his jacket and pulled him closer. David's breath caught. Vereka stared down at him, her golden eyes glowing under the dim station lights. "Humans are fragile," she said quietly. David swallowed but didn't pull away. "I've noticed." She exhaled slowly. "And yet you still stand here." David's lips curled into a small grin. "Yeah, I do." Vereka studied him for a long moment. Then, without warning, she kissed him. It wasn't delicate. It wasn't careful. It was bold, strong, unmistakable. David froze for half a second. Then his hands gripped her arms, steadying himself against the sheer power of it. And then he kissed her back. The world faded. The station, the whispers, the doubts, none of it mattered. Only this, only him. When they finally parted, David let out a breathless chuckle. "Damn. Remind me never to question your strength again." Vereka smirked. "I will remind you often, human." David laughed, shaking his head. "Yeah, I bet you will." She looked down at him, feeling something strange, something foreign yet welcome. Warmth. Belonging. She had spent her entire life believing that no one could love her, that her size, her strength, her reputation would keep her forever alone. But this human, this stubborn, reckless, fearless human, had proved her wrong. She reached out, gently resting a massive hand against his chest. David covered it with his own, fingers brushing against her calloused skin. She exhaled, feeling her walls crack just a little more. "Stay," she said softly. David grinned, wasn't planning on leaving. And for the first time in her life, Veronica knew. Love needed no size, just the right heart to see it.